Okay, so presentations 101. Here we go. In this video, I'm going to talk mostly about slide presentations, but because poster presentations are really common in STEM fields, I will talk a little bit about poster presentations as well, and then I will close with a few brief words on the presentation that you'll be doing for this class specifically. So let's dig in and start with slide presentations. If you have read the Tufte piece by now, this slide might look a little familiar to you. You know, the slide from I believe it's either the Challenger or the Columbia disaster. I can't remember which one that he talks about in that piece. But you know, you've got this big heading at the top. You've got a ton of text on the slide, and basically what that leads to is something called text fatigue, because basically your brain can only process so much language coming to you at one time. Typically, it can only process language coming through one channel. So you can't both read and listen to text at the same time, unless it's the same text, right? So that's why it's not a great idea to have so much text on presentation slides, is because if you have a ton of text on a slide, people are going to read the text and they're going to stop listening to you. So really, slides should be there for to supplement your presentation, or you know, to supplement the words that you're saying, or to provide a different kind of piece of evidence or support in your presentation than the language. So what do I mean by that? A really good way to relieve text fatigue is to use what's called the assertion evidence style of presentation. Well, basically, the assertion evidence style basically just means that you have an assertion up here in the heading section, the heading area, and then you give evidence in the main part of the slide. And that evidence should be as visual as possible. So on this slide, I have an assertion up here at the top. My assertion is, to relieve text fatigue, use the assertion evidence style. And then I have evidence. And my evidence is a picture of a slide that has, you know, mainly images, but then a little bit, it's not really an assertion, but it's very little text. It's sort of a section slide, if you will. And then I would use this slide, this presentation genres and overview slide, to talk about the difference between a TED Talk and, you know, a talk where you're trying to persuade investors or whatever, I suppose. So that's my evidence for this assertion. Kind of cheeky, but you know, that's an example. And you can see there's very little text on the slide, obviously. Your assertions could possibly get a little bit long, so you might want to clip them if that might happen, to, again, avoid that text fatigue. But you don't necessarily have to, unless it's like a whole paragraph. But don't have a whole paragraph on your slide. Okay, so what kind of evidence can you use in your assertion evidence style of a slide? Well, primarily visual is the goal. So here is a chart. It's a graph, my bad. A line graph here, and this is even maybe a little too much text, honestly, because there's, you know, a lot of text here, text here, text here, text here. So someone could kind of get lost in this if you just have it on the slide. But the main focus is this visual point here, and you will be talking about it and telling them what's here and what's here and what's, you know, so this isn't great, but it's not awful either. You can also use charts, other kinds of charts and graphs. What's this? A pie chart, that's what it's called. Wow, brain fart. This is better, but these figures are really, really small, so it's also not great. These are all just examples that I just stole off Google Images, so you know, your images will be much better because you will generate them yourselves. So yeah, very little text, but it's also like the text is small, so you wouldn't be able to read it very well. So that's what makes it not as good as it could be. But you can very clearly see, you know, here's the different parts of the chart. There you go. It's also doing that thing that Microsoft products like to do, which is make the graphic 3D-ish for no reason. And that's, well, you'll read, if you haven't already, about Tufte's opinions of 3D graphs. So I'll just let him rant about it instead of me. You can also just flat out use an image if that's appropriate. So this is an image of a bioscanner. So you stick your palm on this little thing here, or no, this little thing here in the middle, and it scans your fingerprints essentially and lets you in or doesn't let you in according to whether or not you're in their database. This is at a gym. If you were giving a presentation on security for a building, you could use this and say, oh, yes, we have these bioscanners. There you go. So let's see. You can also use that kind of just a photo is evidence for an assertion. Okay, what else? I don't recommend that you use text-heavy tables. Even though this is a visual display of information, it's still got so much text that it's not really going to be great for a slide presentation. A table like this would be much better if you're giving a conference presentation as a handout, actually. And you can, if you have a specific place in your presentation where you want someone to refer to a table, you don't necessarily have to have it up here. You can pass out the table beforehand and say, and now you can see on the table, blah, 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 blah. And your slide could just say, see table, if you want to. But again, people aren't going to be able to read this from the back of the room, essentially, is why it's not great to use it in a slide presentation. Okay, so those are the kinds of evidence that you can use. You also want to essentially, instead of just sort of, how do you figure out how to organize your information? And one good recommendation that I've found is to sort of try and tell a story using a 3-act structure. And you could also potentially think about this as a problem solution impact kind of setup. So you start with a setting and a protagonist. Who are the characters in your story? There's some kind of an imbalance, some kind of conflict. And in your case with the IMRAD presentation, what research question is driving your project? And then in Act 2, you tell us all about how you conducted your methods, what are your results, and that kind of thing, evidence for your main points in your presentation. And then in the very end, you want to, you'll get to essentially the end that will say, this is what we found, this is what our results mean. So that's sort of the discussion part of the presentation. And you'll want to restate what the imbalance was, talk about the solution. This is kind of the climax of the presentation, and you'll come to some kind of a resolution. This might not map precisely onto that IMRAD structure, but if you're using a structure other than IMRAD, this is a good way to go. I borrowed this from some presentation book, and I can't remember which one, and I don't have it cited in this very old set of presentation slides, so my bad. But the other way that you can organize this presentation specifically is, of course, in the IMRAD kind of way. Very similar to your paper. It doesn't have to be massively different. You just have to condense the information because we are going to be listening to it instead of reading it. Okay, let's talk about poster presentations. And again, we're not doing one of those in this class, but they will come up often enough in STEM careers that I feel it behooves me and you to go over this in this class. So the main thing to remember about poster presentations is that they are a really weird, unique genre. You might call them a hybrid genre. They combine sort of semi-impromptu spoken delivery, very casual conversation style of speaking with good visual design because you do have a poster there. So you've got this visual thing that should be able to sort of stand on its own. So you want to get the main points onto your poster, and that requires good visual design, which we don't really talk about in this class, but good visual design, contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. Those are the principles of good visual design, which you can remember by the acronym CRAP. So you've got the text that should ostensibly be able to stand alone, and then you've also got, in a typical poster session, it's just a bunch of people standing in front of their posters and other people wandering through their posters, talking to the people who are standing at the posters. So you've also got that conversational spoken aspect of it as well. And you want it to sort of sound conversational, but you should also prepare. You should have a little sort of elevator pitch where you give the very basics of your presentation, and if someone has more questions about, or the very basics of your project, and if someone has specific questions, then you can go deeper into a specific aspect. So that's why posters are really interesting, because it's actually one thing that is, so it's unique in that you have this thing that should be able to stand on its own in a way that slide presentations aren't supposed to be able to stand on their own, because guess what? You can't just plop all of your text onto a slide presentation, which is sort of what I was just talking about. But you also have that spoken element, and it is supposed to be much more casual than a slide presentation. However, one thing that's similar is that one reason that you get slide presentations with a ton of text on the slide and poster presentations with a ton of text on the slide is that presenters often want to use it as a memory device as opposed to a visual aid, which is what both of these things are supposed to be. And so the trick is, if you know your material and you just have the visual aid, you can just use the visual aid as a visual aid. If you don't know your material very well, the temptation to rely on it as a memory device and plop all of your text on there is going to be pretty strong. So the moral of the story is, know your material, use your visual aid as a visual aid. Because here's what happens when you don't use it as a visual aid. Here's an example that I, again, just pulled off of the internet of a poster presentation, and like, look how much text is on there. It's so tiny. They basically have tried to cram their entire paper on this slide, and it's illegible. I mean, granted, we're not in presentation mode, and it's my computer screen, and your YouTube, whatever the size of the the video that you would see on YouTube is not going to be as big as an actual conference, presentation screen, but you're still not going to be able to read that. So yeah, too much text because they wanted to put the whole paper on the slide. Here's another example. There's slightly less text, but there's still just a ton of text, and their visual aids are also actually very small. This poster should either be bigger or they should have less text and focus more on the visuals here. I've got two examples that are a little bit better. So you see, as opposed to several paragraphs of like 10 sentences long, they have 1, 2 paragraphs of like 3 sentences long, 4 bullets here, 3 bullets here, a bullet apiece here, and some visuals. It's a lot less cluttered and a lot easier to read. So but that you get the gist of it, of this project, if someone was just looking at the poster as opposed to listening to someone talk about it. But it's not overwhelming. And another example, this one's not quite as good as the other one, but you can see they've got a lot more white space in between the posters. They're using more bullets as opposed to just, the one up here is just a huge wall of text. So overwhelming and very difficult to read. So this is going to be slightly easier to read. They've got a few visuals, and there you go. Okay, so that one's a better example. Let's transition now to talking about the presentations you'll be doing for this class. Essentially, here is an assertion evidence style slide where my assertion is your presentation for this class is a slide presentation. Here's an example of a slide. So there you go. You'll be creating a slide presentation that is based off of your MRAD project. Here are the requirements. It is collaborative. It's based on your MRAD paper project, which of course is the collaborative part, or it's also collaborative. And the slide presentation should be kind of conference style, and that just means it's a slide presentation and not a poster presentation. And it should probably be about 20 minutes long. It should have recorded narration, so you're not just going to throw some slides together. You are going to have to speak, even though this isn't a face-to-face class. You will record the narration and put that narration into the presentation itself. And there are different ways to do that depending on the technology you use, and there will be some resources in Canvas for you to figure out how to do that. And last but not least, every group member should participate in the narration. I do want to hear every group member participate in the speaking. So those are the requirements. That's it in a nutshell, and that's Presentations 101 in a nutshell. thank you very much for for watching this video. And as a last note, this is a nice way to always end your presentation, especially slide presentations, with a thank you slide, as opposed to just sort of saying, yeah, I'm done. That's it. That's sort of like awkward end to something. A very confident end to a presentation will, you will say your final sentence, and then you will say, thank you very much for listening. Here's my email address if you would like to contact me. Are there any questions? That kind of a thing, as opposed to just going, oh yeah. I'm sure you've seen many a presentation, as I have, where that is the end of the presentation. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions about this presentation or about the presentation project in general, you can email me. You can, of course, hang out with me, chat me, whatever, all the usual channels. Thanks again for watching.